Hi, this is Mackerel Phones. In my video about Abai Kunenbayev's selected poems, I included a few color photographs dating back to before the October Revolution, years before 1917. Most people don't know that color photography goes back that far. I certainly didn't. The first experiments with color photography were in the first half of the 19th century. See this ribbon? The great physicist James Clerk Maxwell described a three-color process in a paper that would allow color photography. That was in 1855. This photograph was taken in 1861. Color photography goes deeper back in time than you'd expect. Not a super remarkable subject for the first color photograph, but pioneering work is rarely glamorous. If I understand correctly, to achieve the color effect, 3 photographs were taken detecting different wavelengths of color: red, green, and blue.
The positive slides were then put into 3 different projectors. The filter that was used to take that original negative was placed in front of the projector. When you projected these 3 different color images upon each other, it produced a full color image.
This red, green, blue color model is still used in technology today, but I don't think in quite the same way.
If you look at your iPhone with a loupe, or your television screen, or your computer screen with a loupe, get in very close, you'll see the same red and violet and green dots or lines.
So where does the Tsar come into this? Here, we have probably the longest title in my collection, as in not the overall length of the book, but only the title itself. Photographs for the Tsar, the pioneering color photography of Sergei Mikhailovich Prokudin-Gorsky, commissioned by Tsar Nicholas II, edited with an introduction by Robert A. Allshouse. The book itself is thick, tall, rather on the heavy side. The pages are glossy to accommodate the many full-color photographs, though it doesn't quite fit on the shelf. Look at that beautiful building. What is that, a church? The Russian photographer Sergei Mikhailovich Prokudin-Gorsky was deeply interested in color photography. According to this essay by Robert A. Allshouse, Prokudin-Gorsky believed photography in what he called natural color would be invaluable for memorization and education. The eye, he wrote, sensates nature and not a picture. Color photography was infinitely superior to monochromatic photography because, quote, ordinary photography is especially helpless in the reproduction of the vegetative world, in geology, ethnology, etc. It reproduces the shapes of the objects and not the contents. Therefore, one could only conclude that, quote, photography in natural color is the best way to teach and to provide an example. Photography penetrates into all domains of knowledge. Memory, aided visually by an interestingly exhibited subject, will leave our ordinary methods of memorizing far behind. Prokudin-Gorsky was a minor nobleman from St. Petersburg. Strangely, Allshouse states, quote, it is said that he was descended from one of the oldest noble families in the province of Vladimir, so perhaps the noble title was unsubstantiated. In 1889, Prokudin-Gorsky traveled abroad, studying color photography in France and Germany. Apparently, he got his business career started taking photographs in Korea during the Russo-Japanese War. I'm always interested in these kinds of international connections. If I understand right, Prokudin-Gorsky developed his own 3-color process based on a version descended through successive experiments from Maxwell's. He had, in fact, developed a system of producing 3-part color photographs that could be projected simultaneously. Using a small folding hand camera of the type designed by Meat, he photographed 3 exposures of the same subject, made at about 1-second intervals on a glass plate approximately 84 to 88 millimeters wide and 232 millimeters long, which was mounted vertically in the camera. The plate dropped to a new position after each exposure, and the image was captured through 3 different color separation filters. Because of the need to take the same picture 3 times, Prokudin-Gorsky was limited to subjects that would make no movement. Thus, much of what he recorded consisted of fixed objects. Meat is Adolf Meat, a chemist in Berlin who worked on color photography. Prokudin-Gorsky dreamed of traveling through the whole Russian Empire, photographing life, objects, people, and places everywhere. Viewing the color photographs on projectors, students could see their whole country from the classroom. His faith in color photography reminds me a bit of the Bolsheviks' view on the educating power of cinema. The sheer scope and magnitude of the project was mind-boggling, and it began to take on the aura of a dream. It would have remained so had not fate, in the person of the Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich, intervened. The Grand Duke, the honorary chairman of the St. Petersburg Photographic Society, already knew of Prokudin-Gorsky's work. So, finally, through photographs chosen to appeal to the Tsar's politics, maneuvering through the right bureaucrats, and, frankly, lucky connections, Prokudin-Gorsky met Tsar Nicholas II himself. The Tsar agreed to sponsor the project. Prokudin-Gorsky was given 2 documents. One would allow him to travel anywhere in the empire, including areas normally kept secret to the public, and the other stated all officials should do anything needed to assist the photographer. Clearly the Tsar took this mission very seriously. We're lucky he did. I can almost imagine he had a sense that the world of Tsarist Russia would soon end. Or I would if the Tsar were not so cut off from reality. But that is the remarkable thing about this book. The photographs are not only in full color, breathing almost shocking life into an age we're used to seeing exclusively in monochrome. They are photographs of a disappeared world. From 1909 to 1915, Prokudin-Gorsky traveled the Russian Empire, working tirelessly day and night to take and develop his photographs. At least pretty often working tirelessly. I mean, that's 6 years, he must have taken a break sometimes. Then, Europe went completely insane. Or rather, their complete insanity finally boiled to the surface. World War I happened. It put a stop to Prokudin-Gorsky's travels, and he took up boring work for the War Ministry. He didn't want to be hogging the railways when troops and material had to be transported to the front. Prokudin-Gorsky grappled with questions of how to mass-produce his color photographs for education. Then, the October Revolution happened. Increasingly uncomfortable in Soviet St. Petersburg, Prokudin-Gorsky would become a refugee. In 1918, he took his photographic slides and left Russia with his family. This was not like before, Allshouse tells us. This time, he was never to return to St. Petersburg. Spending the rest of his life in Britain, France, and Norway, Prokudin-Gorsky, the great photographer, fell into obscurity. He continued researching photography, and apparently cinematography too, but died in 1943. In 1948, his sons Mikhail and Dmitry sold 1,600 photographic plates to the Rockefeller Foundation. From there, they ended up in the Library of Congress. So, is this book just an account of his travels? Not at all. With the backstory established, here's the book. It assembles Allshouse's selection of these photographs. Today, the effort seems almost unnecessary. These photos are online. They've got Prokudin-Gorsky's body of work at Wikimedia Commons, at least a lot of it. But in 1980, you would have had to travel to the Library of Congress yourself to see them. Photographs for the Tsar is divided into 7 chapters, a prologue, and an afterword. I've told you about the prologue. Each chapter contains photographs concerning a different subject, and opens with a 1-page essay giving some background. I admit, I never actually read through this whole book. Read might not be the word, since those words are few in number here. There are some, though, in the negative space between the photos, simply explaining what the photos depict. So, let's get started. This is such a nice-looking book. You can see there on the back cover, there's even a big photograph of Prokudin-Gorsky in the flesh, sitting on some rocks by a brook, kind I would have hung out around when I was a kid, probably. The first chapter is village life, and even has a quote from Tolstoy. How fancy. By the turn of the century, the problem of peasant overpopulation, coupled with a shortage of land, brought despair and anger to the countryside. A major restructuring effort that would permit private ownership of land was necessary, but it would not come until the Revolution of 1905 startled Nicholas II into allowing the dissolution of the Mir. It was hoped that this wager on the strong would stimulate a demographic shift to the towns, thereby giving Russian industry the workforce it so badly needed. The village scenes photographed by Prokudin-Gorsky were taken from life, with the exception of the one rather theatrical pose in front of an izba or log cabin. Perhaps the apparent tranquility the photographer depicted allowed the Tsar to lose himself in the beauty of the natural colors. all the time reminding himself that this, the real Russia that Rasputin assured him truly loved him, was loyal to the Romanovs. Lots of these log cabins like I've never really seen anywhere, and of course some really fancy church in the background. But already, even on this first 2-page sprawl, we can already see that there are some imperfections and problems with the photographs. Although great efforts were made to reproduce these remarkable photographs at the highest quality levels possible, there are imperfections visible in places. Time has taken its inevitable toll on some of the fragile glass photographic plates, causing flaws in prints. Also, the primitive techniques employed occasionally cause blurring in the original plates. Because of overriding historical interest, such factors were overlooked several times during the selection process. And it's time to face another reality. Not all the photographs in this book really are color photographs. Although, this is still some really nice black and white photographs, still gives you a view of a kind of village life that is totally gone now. Look at all these peasants gathered around this cabin here. I suppose this is the theatrical pose that was referred to in the opening essay? I mean, it must be, right? But we have plenty of color photographs here, too. Just look at that guy right there, wearing a red shirt. You mean, of course people used to wear colors, but you almost don't think of them that way. You see them so rarely in photographs. And of course, there's a woman in a red skirt, too, outside of a cottage with a thatched roof. Just look at these full-color photographs of these peasant women. I mean, it's incredible. We just have this view of these normal, average women who no one has heard of and who by now are surely totally forgotten except for these photographs of them. It's just incredible, someone, even if he is doing it ultimately in the name basically of propaganda and the Tsar, somebody's preserving normal peasant life like this. It's like, kind of like that one Scandinavian painter. Look at all these peasants gathered up in a line. I really like the look of that guy on the far right there, with the cane and the top hat and the medals. All these more peasant women. Look at them. I particularly like the pose of this group right here. They're just kind of strange looking. The caption just says women's work, above, cooking. As if these women are cooking, rather than standing in a row outside a cabin holding plates of food. Here are just some more black and white photographs. These two girls are apparently from the village called Torovo. But what really caught my attention on this page is this giant marshmallow-looking lump, which is, in reality, apparently a haystack with a sheet of snow on top. Prokudin-Gorsky took a photo of Lev Tolstoy, the great Christian anarchist pamphleteer novelist, that Tolstoy, the Tolstoy are at War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, the Tolstoy who's like a cornerstone of Russian literary culture, or forget that, of Russian culture, that Tolstoy. We have a color photograph of that guy. How many 19th century literary figures are there where we have color photographs of them, huh? Not many. Now, okay, so this photograph here is not the color photograph of him. Rather grumpy looking guy, honestly. Like a patriarch of the Old Testament, Tolstoy denounced the corruption and injustice of his age in thundering terms. In the words of historian Ivar Spektor, he was the only author in Russian literature who could speak with authority even to his rulers, who could prophesy their downfall, and yet emerge unscathed. And here is the photograph itself. Lev Tolstoy in natural color. In fact, this makes Lev Tolstoy one of the only 19th century literary figures, and certainly the only I know of, who we not only have a color photograph depicting, I don't want to end the sentence with a preposition, but it's also, we have him on film. We have a color photograph and film footage of Lev Tolstoy. In those days, they could make a movie that was just Lev Tolstoy walking through the snow, and that was enough. Of course, people got bored of that kind of thing after a while. This wasn't too far removed from the days when a movie could just be a couple minutes of a street corner recorded. And you see, Lev Tolstoy is such a big deal that his chapter is only these 4 pages. See, we're already on the next chapter here, rivers and waterways. I believe there was a particular interest on the part of some Tsarist officials in just having photographs of rivers and canals and that kind of thing, which isn't of much interest to me, usually, even though rivers are immensely important for transportation and for holding the country together in very many ways. There's a reason that the first civilizations tended to form around river valleys. It's because where it allowed people permanent settlement to farm in the fertile soil. And there's a reason that trade routes have historically generally been rivers, because there weren't highways. There were just rivers to send the boats down, ferrying goods from port to port. Oh, look at these sailors. But looking at these Russian guys with their big beards and mustaches and these white sailor suits, though, I can't help but remember Battleship Potemkin. A bit perverse, perhaps, to mention that here, given the context of that movie was made in, compared to these photographs. I wonder if they were using just leftover sailor uniforms from the Tsarist period when they were making that movie. This guy here in the corner, we actually know who that is, apparently. His name was Pinchas Karlinski. This is him at the age of 84, after 66 years of service, the caption tells us. Standing there with this staff. It's incredible, you know? Here I am talking about this guy, Pinchas Karlinski, this many years after he must be dead. Wonder if anyone will be talking about me in that much time. By the way, this sailor appears to be having a bit of a photographic issue. Is that a cross on that net? Maybe it's just something shaped like a cross. I guess the Russian Orthodox cross is shaped a little differently, isn't it? Speaking of crosses, this next chapter here is Churches and Icons. The Orthodox spirit of contemplation and the revelation of eternal mysteries inherent in the faith were captured by Prokudin-Gorsky's lens in all their timeless splendor. For the Tsar, a man who was sincere in his religious devotion, these photographs in particular must have projected the essence of Russia. And now we just have a bunch of pages of photographs of churches and icons like they promised. I mean, I just think these are really pretty looking, seeing these ancient, well, they're not ancient. What am I saying? It's just like 100 years ago. But seeing these churches in full color like this with all these, like, I mean, look at the, those must be graves outside this church. It's just sort of incredible to me. Can you see that, like, fruit fly that's flying around in here on the camera? Is it in the shot? And here we have the miraculous icon of the Digitria Virgin. It's so intricate. It's like Baroque. It's beautiful, but you gotta keep in mind that all these churches that were so lavishly decorated, inlaid with gold and these big, beautiful onion domes, these were being erected at the expense of peasants who were living in crowded huts. This really isn't the best distribution of resources they could have been undertaking. It's no wonder that for so long in Tsarist Russia, for like a century at this point, there had been a strong sense that something had to change, that something was gonna give sooner or later. Look at this one! The detail of the Church of SS Peter and Paul in Yaroslavl? It's covered in these, like checkerboard pattern. I mean, it looks really nice. It reminds me of the architecture in, say, Kirby's Dream Land 2. Wow. Look right here at the, Tower of Trinity Cathedral. You can see this shock of red. It's just incredible seeing a bright shock of red like that from way back then. I know that Allshouse indicated that these photographs were all, of still environments mostly. But you see this, and you kind of think, well, really? Because here are these monks who are apparently at work planting potatoes. What did he do? You can almost imagine that Prokudin-Gorsky went to these monks and said to them, okay, guys, just stop where you are. Give me a minute. I want to get a photograph of you guys hard at work here. With my photograph, I'll immortalize your physical appearances, just as your work for the Lord is immortalizing your souls. I really like some of these pictures of churches because they're just so crisp looking. It's almost incredible to think you see that and you think that really was 100 years ago. It's just incredible to me. The age of these photographs gives them an almost dreamlike aura. Also, that fly had just landed on the page. Fruit fly, I mean, look, you're a cool roommate and all, but I don't want you in here right now. I love how in this photograph of an abbey here, you can just see the face of this woman. It's like pitch black, and there's a human face floating there. You see, that's what I mean when I say this stuff can be almost kind of dreamlike. It's just an interestingly framed photograph, basically. That's apparently Abbess Mother Tygia? Not quite sure how to pronounce it. Some of these photographs, I could just open up to a page and just stare at them for like a long time. You know, my imagination running wild, imagining the sort of things that might go on there, or what it might be like to be inside some of these buildings. Ah, look! I've run across a bookmark. This must be the page that I originally got up to when I was first, reading this book. Well, it's time to go a bit farther than that. You know, 'cause I'll do like my late grandfather did and go through the whole thing. Look at this! Look at this interior of this church of St. John the Baptist. Look at this! It's just incredible! It almost, it's like it's one solid mass. It almost reminds me of those churches carved from stone they have in Ethiopia. Like carved into mountainsides. Covered in these, wall paintings, everything covered in paintings. Now that is like a wonderful example of the way that religious devotion can inspire art. Although I suppose that we can't be sure that the very people who painted these were inspired by those things. Maybe they were just hired by people who wanted it done. I don't know the history of the Church of St. John the Baptist in Old Ladoga. Oh look! It's the vestments of the Patriarch Job at the Monastery of the Assumption in Staritsa. Yeah. This is incredible artwork. I love the way that halos are drawn in religious iconography, where it's not like a circle above the head like you see in cartoons, but it's a whole circle, like a disc behind their head, like the sun is displayed right behind them. Maybe that has something to do with why in like the Roman Empire there was a period where like Jesus was associated with sun deities. And our next chapter is the Urals, which is a region that, at the time at least, I don't know what's going on in the Urals these days, was a major industrial center. Even in the 18th century, there were metal factories around there, where the famous revolutionary Pugachev, during the Pugachev revolt, would gather support from the workers from these factories. Although it says here that by the early 1900s, there were also timber industry, which was very important. To get to some areas that were nearly inaccessible, Prokudin-Gorsky used a Model T Ford, as there were no suitable vehicles made in Russia at the time. From the entrance gates at the Tagil something works, to Ekaterinburg, one of the oldest metallurgical centers in the Urals, the photographer graphically portrayed Russia's industrial expansion. In viewing Prokudin-Gorsky's pictures, Nicholas II could assess the advances already made and project an even greater future for Russia as she exploited the resources of these territories. And, the author doesn't add, exploited the people in them. People, I suppose, like, these peasants in this, well, I guess it's some kind of strip mine. To give you an idea of how utterly remote the Urals were, this is apparently a seat of government. These, like, little shacks on top of all this, like, tiers of soil, which is, I assume, where that previous photograph was taken, now that you see it. And here we see a photograph of Ekaterinburg itself. Is it named after the Tsarina Catherine? And here are just some photographs of different factories and metalworking plants. You might notice that on this one here, it's decorated with marks of the hammer and sickle. I guess it was already a symbol of workers before it ended up becoming a symbol of the communists. This is just a photograph of some train tracks at the Simsk station. but it's unusually crystal clear, which is why I'm even mentioning it. It almost looks like a modern HD photograph, just a little too blurry, I guess. Alright, apparently these photographs all come from the city of Zlatost. That's how I'd pronounce it. We have these guys here. One of these guys is Andrei Kalganov, presumably not the woman. I assume he's the older-looking guy in this fancy robe, since it says that he's with his son and grandchild, but it kind of makes me a little curious here. Is that woman his grandchild? I guess. And we also, of course, have the photograph of this marvelous-looking little factory here. And our next chapter is the Caucasus, the rugged Caucasus Mountains, a 745-mile range extending between the Black and the Caspian Seas, was long considered the boundary between Europe and Asia. Legend and history had blended together there in a way that captured the imaginations of several generations of Russians. They had some fierce resistance from the various Muslim tribes that were, had lived there already, but they ended up being incorporated into the empire of the Tsar anyway. This book was apparently published back when the normal spelling of Muslim in English was M-O-S-L-E-M. You don't, see that spelling too much anymore. Why, speaking of the locals, here are apparently, a Dagestani couple. You can see them in what I assume is some sort of distinctive national dress. The two women on the bottom are Armenian. This is the kind of stuff that really interests me, is like photographs of these ethnic minorities. So, for example, these is just apparently a group of Dagestani women. I'm not really sure who they are, I guess just some local women he found. And this particular marker right here was apparently established to mark the spot where Shamil was captured, who was a nationalist leader against the Russian occupation. There's a lot of ethnic diversity going on here. Kurds, Armenians, Greeks, even Chinese. Look here, this guy is apparently Chinese master tea grower Lao Zhenjian. Speaking of tea, this is apparently somewhere on a tea plantation, specifically the Chakva tea plantation. These aren't like tea trees. Tea grows in bushes. That's just a grove that happens to be on the plantation, I suppose. I also like that we're able to see this part of the tea processing factory. In fact, that's what we have this stuff from the tea factory also. We have these photos from a tea factory and the tea plantation and a photograph of these women, these laborers in the tea plantation. It's really some marvelous stuff. How often do you get to see a photograph of just working people all posed together from those days? You know, it's amazing. This is a hotel. It's a fancy looking hotel. I mean, I think I've certainly never seen a hotel that looks like that. Look at this woman. Just portrait of a lady. Wonder who she was. Wonder what she was thinking about when this photo was taken. There's a whole story there. That's the thing about photography, is there's something ghostly about it. Isn't there? Alright, now we're on Turkestan and Samarkand. This is getting into stuff I'm really interested in. The exact date of Samarkand's founding is not known, but legend places it some 5,000 years ago in the reign of King Afrasiab. The first written reference to Samarkand is a description in Alexander the Great's campaign in 429. And he destroyed it. Ironically, it was a person who viewed himself as a successor to Alexander the Great, the conqueror Timur, who ended up really expanding Samarkand into this marvelous city in the 14th century or 15th century, I think. In any case, like Alexander the Great, Timur was a monster, and you should have no respect for him. Here's just some guys just in Samarkand. Look at that amazing architecture behind them. Although you can tell that it's sort of unmaintained, it's sort of crumbling. But I guess these guys just were used to living among that. Maybe it's like how around where I live there's so many badly maintained roads. We have a photograph of camels in the snow laden with cargo, a yurt with a Kyrgyz couple sitting outside. It's just marvelous stuff. This alone is worth the price of admission to this book, is these photographs of Central Asian folks. Like, look at these guys. Look at that guy with his camel, with his big, fancy Turkmen-style hat. Or look at that Kyrgyz family, just sitting in the grass, taking a break from walking around all day. I like this woman just sort of standing in profile in front of this yurt. I wonder what it would be like inside. Did he have any photos of the interiors? You know, every person in every one of these photos is dead. You know, I noticed there's a big nest right here on this tower by the mosque. What's those towers called? Minaret? I think that's what they're called. Just look at these great color photographs. Just look at these guys. I just think it's incredible. It's like magic being able to see this world. And yet it's not another world. It's the very same one in which you and I both live. But then again, in a very real way, it isn't, is it? This is a world from a long time ago that no longer exists, not in the way that it did then. And someday, the world we live in will also be just a memory, preserved in the ghosts of text, video, and photographs. And I suppose sound, too. We have that. Look at this one! What is this? It's like lumps like out of Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker. It would seem to be some kind of burial site, though. Kushbegi, Minister of Internal Affairs at Bukhara. It's just amazing to me. It's amazing. This is one of my favorite photographs in the book, is just this guy sitting surrounded by these huge stacks of carpet. He's just marked a dry goods merchant. It's a shame that unlike some of these people, they didn't record his name. Who do you think he was? What was he doing that day? What did he eat for breakfast? These and many other mysteries we'll just never solve. So many people leading so many kinds of lifestyle in these places. This guy is apparently a rabbi teaching some Jewish schoolboys. It's such a marvelous photograph, and look how they're dressed. It's lovely. You almost think of people in the past as dressing in drab, like grays and browns, but that's not true at all. Even in medieval times, people liked wearing bright colors. People like colorful things, and people have always dressed in bright colors. Probably about as long as people have dressed in anything, anyway. This was one of the photos from my video on Abay Kunimbayev's selected poems. It was intended to show the extreme level of covering that women wore in Central Asia and many places at the time. It says she's a Sart woman. Not sure who that is, but I assume the Sarts must be another one of the many ethnic groups of the region. Or like, look at these two guys here, these prisoners. The description takes the time to tell us that the famous Peter Kropotkin described such fettering in his In Russian and French Prisons. I'm a big fan of Kropotkin, you know. It's the interior of a madrasa. But bizarrely, it looks like it too is sort of in ruins to some extent. I guess in the same way that this madrasa is kind of in ruins, so was the whole czarist world that existed in these days. And here's our final photograph in the book, or at least before the epilogue, is this photograph of so many native tribesmen, they're called. They don't say who these guys are, just say native tribesmen. Think of all the stories there are on that hill, all the innumerable lives and overlapping experiences. It's just sort of incredible to think of how many people there were, you know, and of course still are. When you sit around all day in sort of atomized cubbies and cells like a guy like me does, you can almost lose sight of how many people there are and how very much we're all ultimately interconnected. And then we get to the afterword where it evaluates Prokudin-Gorsky's contributions to, to film history, at least according to this Arthur Goldsmith. And Goldsmith's conclusion is that ultimately, he didn't really contribute that much to photographic history. Of course, his work is incredible. He was a technician as well as an artist. But in the long run, the photographic innovations that ended up making color photography so ubiquitous weren't Prokudin-Gorskий's or based on his work. Prokudin-Gorsky's deep commitment to the value of photography in education and his grand vision in attempting to photograph in color the vast Russian Empire, the most ambitious project of its type we know of, deserve recognition beyond his technical achievements. The former he held for the rest of his life, publishing an extraordinary statement on the importance of color photography for schools and the community in general in the British Journal of Photography, April 8, 1922, in which he promotes his contributions to color photography, attacks the triviality of contemporary cinema, and predicts the importance of visual representations as an educational aid. As for his major project, considering its scope, the limitations of his technology, and the restrictions imposed by an absolutist and sometimes paranoid regime, it was an impossible self-assignment. The remarkable extent to which he succeeded, as reflected in the photographs reproduced here, is a tribute to his skill, energy, and resourcefulness. Look, Prokudin-Gorskий's daughter Helena, she's wearing a sailor fuku. They're real. And our final photograph in the book is of this woman. It's just demonstrating how this photographic technique works. However, as I have mentioned earlier, keep in mind there's a certain propagandistic purpose to these photographs. Tsarist Russia was really not a good place. Actually, I think Arthur Goldsmith already puts it perfectly, so there's no need for me to rephrase it. The images that have survived to emerge from limbo into public availability some 70 years later are a magical glimpse into a world that is forever gone, as remote to us now as the Middle Ages, of which indeed the last days of the Tsarist Empire were a lingering remnant. As an historical record in color, they attest to the imagination and enterprise of the photographer who compiled them, reminding one of Matthew Brady's imaginative scope in deciding to document the Civil War. However, this is the work of one man, not a talented team, and the photographs were made to satisfy the needs of reactionary officials like Rukhlov, to please the capricious Tsar, and, he hoped, to edify the youth of Russia. It would not have been possible even if Prokudin-Gorsky had been so inclined, and we have no reason to believe that this was the case, to document the poverty, degradation, and cruelty of Imperial Russia as it approached the end. Photography's potentially powerful role in documenting social, political, and economic evils was only beginning to be appreciated and utilized even in the most liberal Western states during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. We should not look for Jacob Riis, Louis Hines, or Dorothea Lange here. What we have recorded, in gentle colors, as nostalgic as a half-forgotten dream, is the beautiful surface of Imperial Russia during the last days of the Tsar, its valleys, rivers, hamlets, churches, country villages, farms, and peasants, a Russian Easter egg fantasy rendered poignant by the knowledge of how abruptly, violently, and totally it would all be smashed. You could almost imagine just meeting her today, instead of seeing her as a person from the past.